I'd been wanting to go on a solo camping trip for a while. Between work and the constant noise of city life, I felt like I needed some time alone, out in nature, just to reset. It wasn't my first time camping, but it was the first time I'd be going alone. I've always been pretty independent, so the idea of spending a couple of nights by myself in the woods sounded like the perfect escape. I chose a spot about 2 hours from home, in a national forest known for its hiking trails and isolated campsites. I didn't want to be too far from civilization, but I also didn't want to hear anyone else while I was out there. The campsite I picked was supposed to be fairly remote, tucked away from the more popular spots. I packed up my gear, tent, sleeping bag, some food and the usual essentials, and set off on a Friday afternoon. The drive was peaceful, with the city fading behind me and the landscape changing into rolling hills and thick forest. By the time I reached the forest, the sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting a warm glow through the trees. The campsite was about a mile hike from where I parked. I grabbed my pack, locked the car, and started the trek into the woods. The air was cool and crisp, and the only sounds were the soft crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of the wind through the branches. It was exactly what I needed: quiet, solitude, and a break from everything. By the time I reached the clearing where I'd be setting up camp, dusk was settling in. I quickly pitched my tent, got a small fire going, and sat back, watching the last light fade from the sky. The stars began to appear one by one, and I felt a deep sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in a long time. The first night passed without incident. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, listened to the distant sounds of the forest, and eventually crawled into my tent. The silence was comforting, and the steady rhythm of the forest lulled me to sleep. The next day, I spent most of the morning hiking a trail that wound up into the hills, offering views of the forest below. It was beautiful and peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. I didn't see another person all day, which was perfect. I wanted this trip to be just me and the woods. No distractions, no interruptions. That evening, after another quiet dinner by the fire, I settled into my tent for the night. The temperature had dropped, and a light breeze rustled the leaves around me, but nothing out of the ordinary. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, feeling completely at ease, until I heard it. A branch snapping, loud, close. I sat up, suddenly alert. It wasn't the sound of a small twig breaking in the wind. It was the distinct snap of something heavy stepping on a branch somewhere nearby. I held my breath, listening intently, but all I heard was the wind. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal passing through. The forest was full of wildlife after all, and the sound could easily have been an animal moving through the underbrush. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come as easily. My ears were tuned to every sound outside the tent, every rustle of leaves, every creak of the trees swaying in the wind. About an hour later, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. Another snap, closer this time. I sat up, heart racing. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow outside the tent, but it wasn't enough to see anything clearly. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The light flickered across the clearing, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But then, just as I was about to turn off the light, I heard something else. A faint rustling, like footsteps in the leaves, slow, deliberate, coming from the edge of the clearing. I froze, scanning the tree line with the flashlight, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped as soon as I turned the light in that direction. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was an animal, curious about the campsite. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, amplified by the silence of the woods. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something or someone out there. I zipped the tent back up and sat inside, trying to calm myself down. I reminded myself that I was in the middle of the woods, miles from anyone. The chances of someone being out here at this time of night in this particular spot were slim to none. But the thought didn't make me feel any better. For the rest of the night, I lay awake, listening to every sound outside the tent. The footsteps didn't come back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time morning came, I was exhausted but relieved to see the first light breaking through the trees. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, eager to get back to the car and leave the strange unease behind me. As I hiked back along the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the forest was quiet again, the same peaceful place it had been when I arrived. When I finally reached the car, I threw my pack in the trunk, jumped in the driver's seat and started the engine. As I pulled away from the trailhead, I took one last look at the woods. Nothing was out of place. Just trees, sunlight filtering through the leaves, and the soft rustle of the wind. But I knew what I had heard, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, for at least part of that night, I hadn't been alone. I've gone camping since then, but I've never done it solo again. Something about that trip, those footsteps, the feeling of being watched, stayed with me. The woods, as peaceful as they can be, hold their own mysteries, and sometimes it's better not to be alone to discover them. I've always been the kind of person who seeks out solitude in nature. There's something about being alone in the wilderness that makes everything else fall away. The stress of work, the constant buzz of the city, the expectations from people around you. So when I found a weekend free from any commitments, I decided to take a solo camping trip to a spot I'd been eyeing for months. An isolated ridge about 3 hours from home, far off the usual hiking trails. The ridge was supposed to have incredible views with dense forest at the base and a clear, open sky above. I had found it while browsing a few backpacking forums, though most people avoided it because it wasn't a marked campsite. That was exactly what drew me to it. I didn't want anyone else around, just me and the open sky. I left early Saturday morning, excited to disconnect and be surrounded by nothing but nature for a couple of days. The drive out to the trailhead was uneventful, and by the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. I parked at a small pull-off on the side of a gravel road, threw on my backpack, and started the hike up toward the ridge. The first few hours were perfect. The trail was barely there, more of a deer path than anything, winding through the trees and slowly gaining elevation. It was quiet, with only the sound of the wind in the leaves and the occasional bird overhead. The higher I climbed, the more I could feel the weight of daily life falling away, replaced by that peaceful sense of isolation that I craved. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The view was just as breathtaking as I had imagined, rolling hills stretching out for miles, with the distant glow of the setting sun painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. I found a flat spot near the edge of the ridge, just a few feet from where the trees thinned out and opened up to the view below. It was perfect for setting up my tent. After pitching the tent, I gathered some wood, got a small fire going, and settled in for the night. I had packed light, a few snacks, a book, and a small stove to heat up some instant noodles for dinner. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep me content. As night fell, the temperature dropped, but the fire kept me warm. I sat by the flames, watching the stars blink into view one by one, and felt a deep sense of contentment. There was something special about knowing I was the only person up here, miles from the nearest town, with nothing but the sounds of the forest and the crackling fire to keep me company. But as the fire started to die down, a feeling crept in, something subtle at first, like a nagging thought in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite shake. I was alone, completely alone. The realization hit me harder than I expected. It's one thing to know you're isolated, but it's another to feel it deep in your bones. The vastness of the forest, the darkness pressing in from all sides, it suddenly felt a little overwhelming. I shook it off, telling myself that this was exactly why I came out here. to be alone, to experience nature without any distractions. I fed a few more sticks into the fire and sat back, trying to regain that sense of peace. That's when I heard it, a low, distant rumble. At first I thought it might be a car, far off on the gravel road I'd come in on, but the sound didn't fade. It grew louder, more distinct, and after a moment I realized it wasn't mechanical. It was natural, like the sound of rocks shifting or something large moving through the trees. I stood up, staring out into the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from further up the ridge, beyond where the trees thickened again. My heart started to beat a little faster, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a rock slide, or a large animal moving through the forest. But the sound continued, low and steady, almost rhythmic. I turned off my headlamp, wanting to let my eyes adjust to the darkness, and stood there in the silence, waiting. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint orange light around the campsite. I didn't move, just listened. For a few minutes, everything was still. The sound had stopped, and all I could hear was the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. But then I heard something else, a crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. It was faint but close, too close for comfort. It didn't sound like an animal, it sounded like a footstep. I scanned the tree line with my eyes, trying to see through the shadows, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anything unusual. But the uneasy feeling had returned, stronger this time. I told myself it was just the forest. That sometimes, in the quiet of the night, the woods play tricks on you. The sounds of animals moving through the underbrush, branches shifting in the wind, they can all seem louder, more deliberate when you're alone in the dark. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the circle of light from my fire. I tried to go to sleep after putting out the fire, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there in my tent, listening to every creak, every rustle, every distant sound that seemed to echo through the forest. It was probably nothing, but in the stillness of the night everything felt amplified. Sometime around midnight I heard it again. That same low rumble. Closer this time. I sat up, heart racing, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It wasn't thunder, and it didn't sound like an animal. It was almost like the ground itself was shifting. Suddenly, I felt the faintest tremor under me, like the earth had moved just a little. My first thought was an earthquake, but it was so brief, barely noticeable, that I couldn't be sure. I unzipped my tent, stepping outside into the cold night air. The forest was completely still. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the sky, trying to figure out if what I had felt was real, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But the unease in my gut told me something wasn't right. I packed up my things quickly, more out of instinct than reason. The plan had been to stay 2 nights, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to leave. Something about the ridge, about the sounds, about the way the air felt heavy around me. It didn't sit right. By the time I was halfway down the trail, the sun was starting to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest seemed peaceful again, but the strange events from the night before lingered in my mind. When I reached the trailhead and got back to my car, I took one last look at the ridge. It looked just like any other part of the forest, quiet, beautiful, undisturbed. But something about that place had left a mark on me. I never did figure out what caused the sounds that night, or the strange shifting under my feet. Maybe it was just the natural movements of the earth, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that I haven't been back to that ridge since, and every time I think about solo camping now, I wonder if I'm as alone in the wilderness as I think. I'd always wanted to try solo camping, just me, nature, and the quiet stillness of being completely alone. There's something appealing about disconnecting from everything and everyone, clearing your head, and just existing in the moment. So, when I finally had a free weekend, I decided to go for it. I chose a spot near a remote lake I'd heard about from a few outdoorsy friends. It wasn't an official campsite, but that was part of the appeal. It was isolated, miles away from the nearest road, surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place where you wouldn't hear another soul for days. The hike to the lake was challenging, about 6 miles through thick forest, with a steady incline for most of the way. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting golden light across the water. The lake itself was beautiful, calm, perfectly still, with tall pines reflecting on its surface like a mirror. The air smelled of pine needles and earth, and the only sounds were the distant chirps of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I set up camp near the shore, not too far from the tree line. My tent was small, just big enough for one person, and I had all the essentials, plenty of food, water, and enough gear to get me through the weekend comfortably. I had planned to fish a bit, maybe hike around the lake the next day, and just enjoy the peace and quiet. As evening fell, I cooked a simple meal over a small camp stove and sat by the water, watching the stars slowly appear overhead. There's something almost magical about being by a lake at dusk, the way the water turns dark and mysterious, reflecting the stars like a second sky. It was everything I'd hoped for, a perfect escape. By the time night fully settled in, the temperature had dropped significantly, and the forest was completely still. I crawled into my tent, feeling a deep sense of calm as I zipped up the door and settled into my sleeping bag. It didn't take long for sleep to find me. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard anything or if it was just the remnants of a dream. I lay still, listening carefully, my breath shallow. The forest outside was quiet, but then, there it was again, a soft splash, like something entering the water. I sat up slowly, my mind still foggy with sleep. The lake was just a few yards away from my tent, and the sound had come from that direction. It wasn't a big splash, not like someone jumping in, but more like something or someone walking into the water. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make too much noise, and peered out into the night. The moon was nearly full, casting just enough light for me to see the surface of the lake. The water was calm, completely still except for the faint ripples near the shore. I scanned the shoreline, looking for any sign of movement, but everything was quiet. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just a deer or some other animal coming to drink from the lake, but there was something strange about the ripples. They weren't coming from the edge of the water, they were further out, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the shore, moving slowly in a steady line, like something was gliding just beneath the surface. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the water, but the beam wasn't strong enough to reach that far. The ripples continued, moving across the lake toward the far side, then disappeared completely, leaving the water as still as it had been before. I stood there for a few more minutes, listening, but there were no other sounds, no footsteps, no splashing, nothing. Just the soft whisper of the wind through the trees and the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. An animal, maybe a fish. The woods at night can play tricks on you, and it's easy to imagine things when you're alone in the dark. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, though it took a while for me to fall back asleep. The next morning, the lake was serene and beautiful again, bathed in the soft light of dawn. The strange unease from the night before had faded, and I convinced myself I'd overreacted. I spent most of the day hiking around the lake, fishing, and just enjoying the solitude. By the time evening came, I felt completely at ease again. But that night, the sound came back. It was just after midnight when I woke up to the same soft splashing sound, only this time it was louder, more deliberate. It was as if something, or someone, was walking through the water. I lay there, my heart pounding in my chest, listening. The sound was unmistakable. Slow, steady splashes, like footsteps in the water, coming from the same direction as the night before. I grabbed my flashlight again, my hands shaking slightly as I unzipped the tent and shone the light toward the lake. The beam of light hit the water, revealing a long trail of ripples, moving slowly across the surface, much closer to the shore this time. But there was nothing there, no animal, no person, just the ripples, as if something had just moved through the water and disappeared. I scanned the trees, the shoreline, even the far side of the lake, but there was no movement, no sign of anything. That creeping sense of unease returned, stronger than before. I stood there, watching the water, my breath visible in the cool night air. The ripples faded, leaving the lake perfectly still again. But then I heard something else, a faint rustling sound coming from the trees behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the tree line, but the beam of light flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with it, smacking it against my palm, trying to get it to work, but it was dead. I stood there, frozen, listening to the rustling sound in the trees. It wasn't the wind. It was something moving, slowly, deliberately, just beyond the edge of my camp. I wanted to tell myself it was just an animal, but the steady rhythm of the sound, the way it moved through the trees, felt too deliberate. Like footsteps. I backed up slowly, my eyes darting between the lake and the trees, my mind racing. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could feel it. Something was out there, watching, waiting. Without thinking, I grabbed my gear, threw it into my pack, and quickly dismantled my tent. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night, or that I was miles from the car. I needed to leave. I hiked out of there as fast as I could, the trail barely visible in the moonlight, every sound in the forest making my nerves jump. I didn't stop until I reached the car, and even then I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. I never went back to that lake. I've been on plenty of solo camping trips since, but something about that place, the strange sounds, the ripples in the water, the footsteps in the trees, left me with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Sometimes I wonder if I was really alone out there. I had always thought of solo camping as a kind of therapy, the kind where you're forced to confront your thoughts with nothing but the wind in the trees and the crackle of a campfire to keep you company. I had gone on a few solo trips before, but they were always short, overnight hikes or a couple of days at most. This time, though, I needed more than just a short escape. Work had been stressful, my relationship had recently ended, and I was looking for something that felt more like a reset. So I picked a spot deep in the mountains, far from any established campsites or well-known trails. It was a place I'd read about in a forum, remote, surrounded by dense pine forests, with a small river running through it. The pictures looked incredible, and the idea of not seeing another person for days sounded exactly like what I needed. I planned to be out there for 4 nights. Enough time, I figured, to really disconnect and clear my head. I packed light but had everything I needed: tent, food, my journal, and a couple of good books. I had no cell service out there, but that was part of the point. I wanted to be completely unplugged. The drive to the trailhead took most of the day, and by the time I arrived and hiked into the forest, the sun was already low in the sky. The trail was barely marked, more of a suggestion than a real path, winding through thick groves of pine trees that seemed to stretch on forever. The air smelled fresh, earthy, with that unmistakable scent of pine needles and damp soil. The forest was alive, but it was a calm kind of life, a soft rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call. It was peaceful. After a few hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near the river and set up camp. The spot was perfect, secluded, with the soft sound of the water nearby and tall pines providing plenty of shade. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and settled in as the last of the daylight faded. The first night was exactly what I had hoped for. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire, wrote in my journal for a while, and watched the stars come out one by one. The sky was so clear, so full of stars, it felt like I was seeing them for the first time. There was no noise, no light pollution, nothing to distract me from the vastness of the universe overhead. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the gentle sound of the river, feeling more at peace than I had in months. The next couple of days passed in much the same way. I spent the mornings hiking around the area, exploring the forest and following the river upstream. In the afternoons, I'd sit by the water, read, and jot down my thoughts in my journal. It felt like exactly what I needed: solitude, reflection, and the space to think about everything that had been weighing on me. But by the third night, something had changed. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it was there, the feeling that the forest, which had seemed so welcoming, was now watching me. It started with a strange silence. The soft rustling of leaves, the distant birds, even the sound of the river. It all seemed muted, like the forest had fallen into a deep hush. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the sense of quiet felt too complete, too sudden. I sat by the fire that evening, the flames casting long shadows through the trees, and tried to focus on the book in my hands, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept looking up, scanning the edges of the clearing, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. Just the trees, dark and tall, looming over me. I wasn't sure what was bothering me. I had been alone in the woods before and never felt like this. Maybe it was the isolation. Days without seeing another person, without hearing a voice, can mess with your mind. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. But when I crawled into my tent that night, the unease didn't go away. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent, listening. The river was still there, the water flowing softly in the distance, but there was something else now too, a faint sound barely audible, like something moving through the trees. Slow, deliberate, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The woods were full of wildlife, and it wasn't unusual to hear something moving around at night. But the sound was steady, rhythmic, like footsteps. I held my breath, listening, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The noise was getting closer, circling the camp, but never coming into the light of the dying fire. I sat up, my heart pounding now, and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't want to, but I knew I needed to check. I couldn't just sit there wondering what was out there in the dark. I unzipped the tent slowly, stepped out into the cool night air, and swept the beam of the flashlight across the clearing. The light cut through the darkness, revealing the trees, the river, the empty space around me. But nothing else. I stood there for a long moment, listening, watching, waiting for the sound to return, but the forest was silent again. The footsteps, or whatever they had been, were gone. I went back into the tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the trees made me jump. I lay there, my mind racing, thinking about how isolated I really was. If something or someone was out there, no one would know. No one would hear me. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted. The peacefulness of the first few days had been replaced by a lingering unease. I tried to go about my day as usual, went for a hike, made breakfast by the river, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like the forest was watching me, waiting. By the time evening came, I was ready to pack up and leave, but something inside me, maybe stubbornness, maybe pride, made me stay. I didn't want to give up. I didn't want to admit that something as simple as a few unexplained sounds could send me running. But that night, things got worse. I was lying in my tent again, trying to read, when I heard it. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, moving through the trees. This time they were closer, much closer than the night before. My pulse quickened as I listened, trying to convince myself it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light from the fire. They circled the camp again and then stopped, as if whatever or whoever it was standing still, watching. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, my eyes wide open in the dark, listening to the silence. And then, from just outside the tent, I heard a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. "Are you alone?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't heard anyone approach. There hadn't been any rustling in the bushes, no crunch of leaves underfoot. But someone, something, was there, right outside the thin fabric of my tent, asking if I was alone. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I stayed perfectly still, waiting, hoping that whatever it was would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the voice didn't speak again. The footsteps didn't return. But I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear and left. I hiked out of there as fast as I could, not looking back, my skin still crawling with the memory of that voice. I never went back to that campsite, and I never figured out what I had heard that night. Part of me wonders if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a mix of isolation and fear feeding off the silence of the forest. But another part of me knows that something or someone was out there, and they knew I was alone.